Good morning, everyone. I think the title of this talk, as I was telling Ben while he was waiting with me in the office, is so intriguing that despite the fact that I have 20 people who are lined up waiting for me, I'm going to sit in for this talk today. Since this is part of the Distinguished Lecture Series, Ben, I think you know that the college has turned 60 this year, and we celebrate our Diamond Jubilee. And I think that it's really pertinent to look at what history has done for us as a college. And I think what it has done for us as a college is that it has given us a certain character because of the kind of founder we had. I know that the students have heard this umpteen times, but nonetheless it is always a pleasure for me to mention the fact that it was Brij Kishan Chandiwala Bhaiji who made this college in memory of his mother, Janki Devi, at a time when women's education really was at the margins. But he didn't just make a girls' college. He made a girls' college with a character. He made a girls' college with a vision. And the vision was that it would be truly a liberating, empowering experience for the girl students who came here, who led very, very sheltered lives, belonging as they did to the tradesmen's families, because most of the students who came to this college, and even today, are from neighboring areas where there are a lot of tradespeople, and they lead very, very sheltered lives. And that is why it is in a college like Janki Devi Memorial College that you will find something very special. Perhaps you're not aware of it, students, and I would really like you to become aware of it, that we are perhaps the only college that has a separate vocational center flourishing in its premises called the Janki Devi Vocational Center. And why is that? It's because it started off as something called non-formal college education. So that students who came here not only studied different disciplines, but also learned certain vocations so that they could become financially independent. So here was a man who gave our college a certain character, and we are trying today in our 60th year to build up on that character, to make you more aware, to make you more liberated, and to make you stand on your feet and become self-reliant. So that's my humble take on what history has done for us. I'm sure Ben's talk is going to be, as always, a very, very scintillating one, and I share, Ben, the entire delight and expectation of the audience in listening to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Swatipal, for your kind and inspiring words. Now, quickly, I would like to introduce our distinguished guest for today. Dr. Benjamin Zachariah is currently a senior research fellow at the University of Trier, Germany. His most recent work is After the Last Post, The Lives of Indian Historiography, published in 2019. He's also the author of Developing India, An Intellectual and Social History, Nehru and Playing the Nation Game, The Ambiguities of Nationalism in India. He has worked in developmental imagination, the Nehruvian state, decolonization, and the movement across the world of the major ideas of the first half of the 20th century. He is currently working on global Welkish, thank you, and fascist ideas and their connections with India and the potential value of non-Eurocentric understanding of fascism. Dr. Zachariah has read history at Presidency College, Calcutta, followed by a PhD from Trinity College, Cambridge. He has taught in the United Kingdom, India, and Germany. Title of his paper for today is What Has History Ever Done for Us? I welcome Dr. Zachariah to give his lecture.
Thank you very much, and I'm greatly honored to be here especially at the invitation of a Department of Literature, because my discipline, history, has been more influenced by departments of literature in the last 30 years than one could have imagined. Some have even blamed literary theory for all the evils and ills that have beset the discipline of history in recent times. Yeah. Some have even blamed literary theory for all the ills that have beset the discipline of history in recent times. I'm conscious of the fact that this description of interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity is a contested one. I think in many ways the situation we are in now is a matter of interdisciplinarity not being deep enough, rather than a matter of interdisciplinarity having damaged the disciplines. But then we are in an age called studies, and anything called studies has the danger of being neither one thing nor the other. So when you say somebody is doing something called development studies or critical theory or something like this, I've sometimes wondered whether it's not necessary to be rooted in a discipline. And as a starting point, one could consider that whereas history has a good sense of context, it has very little sense of genre and tone. And I think what happens to a lot of historians is that they miss the joke and take it too literally, or literally. And the contribution of history to literary theory is possibly the fact that nobody has a sense of humor anymore. But what I wanted to talk to you today about is less a research paper and more a kind of existential crisis which affects us all, and which definitely is something that I've been conscious of being a part of. And the title, "What Has History Ever Done for Us?", since historians like footnotes, should possibly be attributed, although possibly subconsciously in the first instance, to a historical film called Monty Python's Life of Brian, in which a group of revolutionaries gets together and tries to work out what has colonialism ever done for us, what have the Romans ever done for us. And of course the irony of that is you go through all colonialism and yet it doesn't quite work to legitimize colonialism. When I started reading history, I had some kind of understanding for myself that the study of history deepened human understanding of each other's ways of living, ways of thinking, and that actually led to a deepening of communication across difference. Now I'm quite sure that the opposite is the result. Circa 1994, which is a long time ago in most of your lifetimes, I was beginning a PhD in Cambridge University. It was just after something called the Oslo Accord, which was supposed to bring peace to Israel and Palestine. And I went to a meeting which was jointly held by the Israel Society and the Palestine Society of Cambridge University. And I heard a very powerful speech from a young woman who said, "We know our history, and it is very conflictual and very terrible. And the point is not to know our history now, but to forget it." And of course, Friedrich Nietzsche famously said that much of what we need to know about history as a guide to life is about how to forget. Now, this is all very disturbing for a student of history, because it's quite complicated essentially to say that this strategic forgetting is at the essence of what we do. And we might point to one other form of forgetting that's been extremely important in our lifetime, and that's a forgetting of the writings of a whole a series of generations of radical thinkers who taught not only history as facts about the past, whatever that is in the post-factual age, but also as an interpretation and a guide to the future. Those who forget history, we were always told, are condemned to repeat it. Those who remember it are condemned to watch other people forget it. That's a little addition. The idea that history can actually guide you is a matter of your understanding of causality, ideology, and analogy. Now, analogy, as Sigmund Freud once said, proves nothing, but it makes us feel more at home. As we do not read history, we do not feel at home in events that form a pattern. If we do read history and we want to keep remembering it, we have a different set of problems, but I would like to come to that slowly. This is my starting question, and I don't know if I'll answer any of it. As history is more and more a matter of public acclamation rather than scholarship, and this is a country that knows this very well, and as the agenda for what histories ought to be or ought not to be are set by public demand, public outrage, or vigilante censorship, it is time to ask what professional historians are for and what professional history is about. Why do I say professional history? Because everybody has some sense of history. We also have the question, which has been raised in recent times, as to whether memory should be considered history, or whether memory has to be legitimized as history in order to make the holders of this memory themselves legitimate. A professional historian who today believes that they are dispassionately studying the past is probably liable to the accusation that there's no such thing as objective history, which we all believe and have agreed with since the 60s. There's always an interest in what we study. But the difference between our starting interests and what we write is the difference between knowing that we cannot achieve an absolute truth and not knowing the difference between the truth and a deliberate lie. And I would like to suggest that in certain cases we are mixing up various categories here, and an epistemological anxiety about what truth is, which historians don't do well and philosophers have abandoned long ago, is taking the place of an attempt to achieve some kind of what I would call intersubjective accuracy. By which I mean we are different people, we all have different starting points, different identities. That's also a key word of our times. But the wonder of it all is not that we all have different perspectives, but that there is a substantial area of intersection, which is agreement. There's an old and probably apocryphal story about a philosopher who was told that his interlocutor didn't believe that there was a reality, that we all make it up. And the philosopher replied, "I refute it thus," and hit him in the face. Therefore, achieving an effect of affect, let's put it in today's terms, which somehow meant that I think, therefore I am is replaced by I feel, therefore I am. So 3 quick points as starting points. We are now more and more faced with public and other pressures on history to deliver serviceable pasts. Somebody needs to use the histories we write for a variety of purposes. And historians are called upon to deliver such pasts. Now, I'm suggesting that this is the instrumentalization principle. It's for a specific use. It is not simply to know. And we know that the idea that we simply know things without a purpose is probably wrong. but the purpose of why we know things is not always available to us when we start. So the idea that we must always know to what end we study is probably not very useful. The second point, and this is a kind of internal critique of disciplines but also of education in general, is what is this discipline of history and what has it become? Do we have such a thing as a discipline of history? And the third related point is who writes history, and is there such a thing as our history? And the last point for me was always the difference between understanding history as kind of universal. And nobody believes in universals anymore. We're all so post-enlightened that we can't distinguish between a universalism of aspiration and a universalism of actual achievement. And my difficulty with the idea that there is an our history is that we must already know who we are before we know whether it is our history or somebody else's history. Many of us here will not be able to agree on a very many things. So,
just
right here?
can you hear the back?
Hello, tasting mango, hello, hello.
Avinash is better than Avinash is doing Yes, this is better, I think.
Better?
Can we use two mics? Is that possible? Both? So I think then it's two songs. Yes, just see.
When we're talking about history now, is that it's been fragmented into various our histories, and many of us will not be able to agree on very many things, since this is now a very divided and contentious world, a very divided and contentious political economy, and a very divided and contentious set of histories. So for the purposes of this gathering, I recommend a temporary suspension of mutual contempt for the purposes of discussion. So who sets the agenda for what historians discuss? Who discusses history? Since we don't believe that history offers truth anymore, let us start with a set of remarks from the memoirs of the Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein. Now, he made a film called The Battleship Potemkin, which I've seen in several fragments, and I've probably seen the same film over and over again several times, but never once through. Yeah. This is probably a metaphor for our times. During the filming, Eisenstein filmed a group of soldiers who were being shot, and they were being shot after being asked to lie down and being covered by a tarpaulin. So the film shows soldiers firing into a tarpaulin, and this piece of cloth then beginning to ooze blood. Cinematically, it's quite an important moment. And some years after the film, a man appeared who claimed he had been one of the men under the tarpaulin. The only problem was Eisenstein made up this scene. It's not a historical scene. He decided that rather than show soldiers shoot a whole lot of sailors and make it look really gory and bloody, it was more important for him to symbolize the violence than to actually show absolute violence. Now, the fact that somebody claimed to have been under this tarpaulin would once have been considered a lie. Today you would say he felt he was under the tarpaulin, and therefore he was under the tarpaulin. Now in this world, we have a slight problem. I have looked recently at the fate of a number of memoirs of the Holocaust, which turned out to be fake. Right? Somebody made them up. And some of them were so well made up that people thought that the writers had actually been in concentration camps when they wrote these memoirs. Now, from today's perspective, you'd say, what's the problem? I mean, this is an authentic account in the sense that if somebody who was actually in a concentration camp can relate to it as real, then does it actually have to be true as well as real? And overwhelmingly, the public response was, you can't lie about the Holocaust. It's too important. And the implication there was, so some people were stripped of their awards. There was this famous Swiss musician who wrote a first-person account of the Holocaust in which he had actually been a protagonist. And this was discovered to be a lie, and there was a big scandal about it. There were various other people who lost their publishing contracts when it turns out that they had claimed to be there, but they'd actually made it up and it was a fictionalized account. Now, I think all these things are enabled by the fact that we don't hold the line between what actually exists and what actually can be imagined to have existed, or in literary terms, the difference between realism and reality is being blurred because we are not sure we know what an absolute reality is. And this comes back to the question of the fact that I said that everybody has a sense of history and uses that sense of history. And a common sense of history was, well, did it actually happen? Literary critic called Stefan Collini, who was incidentally the man who got me out for a duck in my last innings as a Trinity graduate student, wrote some years ago that historians and literary critics before postmodernism had a different kind of problem of authority than scientists writing for laypersons. Their language is or ought to be easy for everyone to understand, and it isn't clear what sort of expertise they are conveying when they engage publicly. But that's perhaps why professional history is so opaque and often unreadable. The new jargon overcomes this previous inferiority complex. But once historians were required to say more or less in a number of public debates, it wasn't actually like that when a public appropriation of history occurred. And historians don't have the confidence to speak with that authority anymore. And it could perhaps be said of academics generally that theirs is a profession based on needing to be intelligent. But there are more stupid people who are academics than we care to imagine. When we talk about truth in history, we actually work out that history has what the late Michel Foucault would have called a soft regime of truth. And this is very visible when history is called upon in other fields. And in particular, you talk about historical testimony before the courts. And this has always been a matter of some contention, right? Because eyewitness account as historical account is actually very different from the account of an actually existing historian. The historian is taught not to accept eyewitness account without problematizing it. There's a very famous case which is an oral history testimony of a number of people in a small town in Italy where a man died in a demonstration. And the man died in a comparatively unimportant demonstration, but everybody in the town believes he died in a more important demonstration, because that more important demonstration was about an issue that was more important to everybody concerned. Now, this transposition of memory so that the death, which is clearly an important event, begins to take the place of the martyrdom in a more important cause than the minor cause during which he actually died, is the normal way in which we give meaning to things. So our affect actually must be mistrusted at all costs. But that mistrust of the affective has instead got us into the situation where what was a building of affect into historical understanding, to take into account the subjective, has meant that the subjective is not just taken into account, it becomes the entire narrative. We have another phenomenon which is not just the question of history and law, where of course the important situation is how do you testify before a court, but also something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission model. Now this is a model that came up in South Africa after apartheid but was used in a number of other contexts. And the argument there was that a kind of inquiry which purports to be somewhat historical in that it deals with the past but also deals with eyewitnesses to the past, can move from subjective remembering and subjective hatred to a kind of consensual narrative of history that creates reconciliation. Now here of course the emphasis is on reconciliation and not truth, because as they always said of the South African Commission, there was very little truth and very little reconciliation in it. It was essentially a way to disqualify certain political figures from participating in the political process in the future, and essentially it was a way to, pardon the use of the word, whitewash apartheid. Yeah? In the question of historical testimony before courts, an interesting thing emerged. Right? The courts held historians to a higher standard of truth than historians held themselves. A court would ask, has a historian looked at what is commonly known already, and has the have to stringent rules of analysis? Have they taken into account conflicting testimony, conflicting sources, and conflicting interpretations in an adequate way? And the court ruled, most notably in the case of the trial of a Holocaust denier, David Irving. And what is interesting is it was Irving who brought charges against Deborah Lipstadt for defamation, because she said he was denying that the Holocaust happened. The court's ruling was that it was Irving who had deliberately ignored contrary evidence and had put forward a kind of understanding of history which was based on arguments that were very one-sided. The court said that there was existing strong evidence that he had not taken account of in his account. Now, again, the question of what you can lie about and the question of the stakes in history, there are certain themes that are more important than others, means that there's a hierarchy of theme. The moment you go high enough and it's about genocide, massacres and holocausts, then you are obviously held to a higher standard of accountability as a historian. But this is also partly coincidental because it is these cases which come before the courts. Now, historians may disagree, and there are in fact quite important disagreements that you could go into, but essentially the accountability of the historian for the account of the past that is actually very influential in the present and the future is no longer regulated by historians. It is regulated outside of history by the courts, and as we all know, things that do not come before a court never end up being argued about. So there's a lot of very bad history out there. And with due deference to members of an academic public, I think increasingly the internal processes of history have failed to the extent that many of the great and informative and politically important histories of recent years have been written by professional journalists. I'm not suggesting that they are not trained in history. I'm not saying that historians are unable to write these books, but it is not the historical profession that will hold historians accountable for what they write. it is the public. What is this public? Now, this is a double-edged sword, right? Do we set an agenda or do we respond? Do we take our cues from a public debate and try to make history relevant entirely in a presentist framework? Or do we not? And we have this theme that I've referred to already, the question of the eyewitness versus history. Some of us have also been witness to what I would call the scramble for memory in the mass production of oral histories, which takes place every time there's either an anniversary or a perception that a generation is going to die out. And then essentially you have a situation which one of my former students referred to as Takumake Thoro, or grab a granny model of history. And what you do there is you find somebody who's old enough, about to die, and then in your perception, and then extract from them whatever they remember and write it up in a model which I would call premature necrophilia. So the question of the mass production of oral histories then becomes the way in which we frame our affect. I want to start, and this is not meant personally, it is meant as a methodological critique, to illustrate not just the problems of oral history, which we know very well. Memories change with time, and it tells you more about the moment of remembering than the moment of history. And if you want event history, you don't look at oral history. There was a book which opened a series of rememberings of the partition of India some years ago, Urvashi Bhutalia, The Other Side of Silence. When this book was in preparation, there were a couple of talks about it. Now, the interviews for this book were done on two sides of an event which should be in public memory even now. It was the destruction of an old mosque called the Babri Masjid in 1992, December 6th. The interviews being done on either side of that event meant that before the event, certain things could not be legitimately said in public, and after the event, certain things could definitely be said legitimately in public. I mean, in particular, the explicit demonization of particular communities and the polarization into communities that has been a feature of Indian contemporary affairs, at least since then, and possibly a little before. And to my mind, any historical testimony that doesn't take account of the distinction between the languages of legitimacy in the first case and on the second case doesn't actually do its duty. It actually needs to take into account context. But one of the reasons a lot of this is written, and one of the reasons why a lot of it is elided, is because we still have a model of history, and by we, I now mean everybody. I don't mean people of my age, gender, sex, class, caste, etc. Sexual orientation. Add as many as you want to this list. I'm saying that we have a model in which what happened in history becomes a guide to our affect in the present and future. You are not your ancestors. It's not your job to avenge historic wrongs. You do not own those historic wrongs, because you are, and this is a model that is an enlightenment model, you are a self-determining individual who can choose what aspects of the past are yours, even if you personally have nothing to do with them. And there are many examples of this. There's an example which I can, identity-wise, claim as my own. I can say that the events that led to the destruction of European Jewry in the Second World War and the Holocaust have little or nothing to do with Jews from the Maghreb, although it affected them more, and certainly has nothing to do with Jews in India. And yet, as a discourse of international Jewish solidarity, based to a large extent on the idea of international Jewish conspiracy, comes into being. This model of the connectedness of the Jewish faith gives you a relationship to a history of which you have not directly been a part, either as an individual through the inheritance of collective memory, or as a collective who has a very different history. So it is actually the learning of certain kinds of history as, within quotes, our history, that is not as universal but as particular, that gives you access to certain narratives. I could say exactly the same about the idea of an Islamic. And I think we ought to start saying the same thing about an entity that has never claimed before to be this internationally connected entity. And I would like here to make the distinction between Hinduism and Hindutva. But I would like not to make the distinction that is often made now. I think that the idea of Hindutva is enabled by the imagining of Hinduism as one thing. And of course we know, and it's historically been written about many times, I have also written about it, that it is the availability of Hinduism for nationalism that makes it possible to see Hinduism as one thing. As opposed to the time where it was the enjoined duty of a Vaishnav to kill a Shaiva and so on. And for that you need to read T.N. Jha. What is ours about our history? Why do we get so upset when a James Lane writes a biography of Shivaji? When Gandhi biographies write about Gandhi as a complex figure, and from which you realize of Gandhi to have been a racist, but it's not all right for Gandhi to have slept with men. I think the example of Eisenstein kind of covers what I was reading in the press about a fictional character called Padmavati. A historian of American Jewish origin who wrote a biography of Aurangzeb, wrote a history of Aurangzeb, admits that the Indian edition of her book is different from the international edition. I have not compared the books. I'm sure there are people in this room who have. But what is disturbing for me is that it's quite clear that censorship, state interference, and even more importantly, self-censorship becomes an integral part of our historical public imagination. Go back a few years and there was a famous controversy about a textbook cartoon which had Ambedkar riding a snail and Nehru pushing the snail on from behind with one of these little sticks you use to push buffaloes along. And that was a metaphor for the slow rate at which the Indian Constitution was being built. And somebody was outraged at the depiction of Ambedkar. Somebody even claimed that Nehru was pushing Ambedkar with that stick. The metaphorical snail was ignored. But I'm sure we will find a good metaphor for the snail which will give us something to be offended by. I realized with some horror that when I was writing my biography of Nehru, I had almost used that very cartoon as the frontispiece. So I admitted this, and I wrote a small newspaper article saying, well, in Ambedkar's own time it would have been impossible to see Nehru and Ambedkar politically as non-equals. A few days later, I noted that the internet was referring to me as a dirty homosexual Brahmin. The only thing in that I would like to dispute is dirty. But we are now in a situation where somebody will dig up a family history where in the Nazi period, you needed at least one Jewish grandparent to be considered a Jew, and therefore the Nazis recognized more Jews than the Zionists did. In current terms, one Brahmin grandparent is enough to be a Brahmin. But you don't, as far as I know, inherit homosexuality, so I'm not sure where that is coming from. This public situation of history writing is also something which is created in large measure by the fact that historians have become far too responsive to public panics in what they write. The idea that there's a perspective and context to things is less evident now. Let's go back to an earlier controversy which I think hit literary studies departments before it hit us as historians. I would perhaps be caricaturing it as the post-colonial moment. But I remember we once read a novella by Joseph Conrad called Heart of Darkness, and Heart of Darkness was considered a metaphor for the corrupt and violent nature of imperialism. And I think everybody knows the double metaphor in Heart of Darkness. It's told by a ship's captain on the Thames about a journey on a ship in Africa. And the Heart of Darkness is ambiguously either Africa, which is what the racist audience he's writing to expects it to be from Conrad, or the Heart of Darkness, which is London, which is the heart of the colonial venture. Now, all of this is forgotten when an African writer called Chinua Achebe says that he feels offended by the way natives are depicted in Heart of Darkness. Now, the passage that I think I remember Achebe means in particular is the ship sailing down the river and being shot at with arrows from the side. And the fact that you cannot see who is shooting is for Achebe something to be offended by, because there are these dark forces who you can't even see assailing the ship of empire. Of course, if you read the text, it's actually an anti-missionary text, because the event that is described in this shooting is the helmsman of the ship, who is the only victim of this shooting and is himself an African. And when he is shot, he is unceremoniously thrown overboard and somebody else takes his place at the wheel. To which the comment of the narrator is, as long as he was alive, there was a great concern to capture his soul, and when he is dead, he is dispensable. Now, why am I saying all this? There's an old understanding that context is how communication works. That if you are to read Conrad in terms of today's audiences, then he perhaps won't reach the audiences he means to reach, because he's not addressing a fundamentally pro-empire and racist audience and exposing them to the contradictions of what they believe. So of course, Achebe's being offended is a big event, because Achebe is already at this point a famous African writer, and therefore his being offended is something that concerns us. I'm reminded of a colleague of mine who teaches at the University of Cape Town, where it is possible to come to class in national dress, which means somebody comes to class in a Zulu national dress complete with his spear, and at one talk thumps the spear on the ground and says, "My ancestor does not like what you're saying." Now, we are faced with very many similar situations now, where histories cannot be told if they are offensive to somebody's sentiment. Now, in that case, we don't have a profession. I'm not that worried about whether we have such a profession or not, perhaps, because I think the other side of what we have been doing is we have lost the idea of what this profession does. Now, some of this is specialization. some of this is the understanding that we do not know enough about histories other than what we were taught as mainstream history. And therefore, specialization and fragmentation is logical. Now, as somebody who studied history in Calcutta University, I recall both the frustration and the joy of being asked to be more or less familiar with 200 and 300 year swathes of history where you have to situate most major events, all major developments, event history, thematic changes and so on. And however frustrating that was and however difficult it was to prepare for an exam in this context, what we did learn is how things connect. The way we would teach now is in fragments. You'd have a module that can be taught within a space of a single semester, sometimes a single term, and one module doesn't necessarily have to connect to one another because you have this idea of choice. Now, in this context, the idea that you might know a lot about porcelain in the French Revolution but not know where the French Revolution happened is not completely unknown. So, again, this is not simply a crisis of the idea of truth, it's also a crisis of the idea of what's an important core. And after maybe 30 years of the idea that you must decenter the meta-narrative, you might be decentering a meta-narrative that doesn't exist anymore. So you're decentering a non-existent center. So, in other words, by circling around a center that once was a center and isn't the center anymore, you keep that center alive for much longer than you would have done had you simply said, we don't want to tell these stories anymore, let's tell another one. So that today, being against meta-narratives is no more than, I don't know the context. And this is not actually very useful for any kind of going with this story, which can get a lot longer, as you can understand. Everybody in a discipline likes to complain about the decline of the discipline. We could add to this story the fact that you cluster around people who have already, within quotes, made it, and you reproduce their stories. You genuflect to the right authority, and that becomes your new center. So much so that non-Eurocentrism is now promoted most of all by mediocrities of European origin in European universities, who are willing to pay a lot of money to get celebrities from the non-Western world to turn up and make more money at European universities to say that Eurocentrism is wrong. And the problem here is, if Eurocentrism is a difficult concept, I don't see how it's non-Eurocentric to simply assert that you're not Eurocentric without knowing European history to decenter. So that a certain form of ignorance has now become a virtue. And if that ignorance is a virtue, then what we have is isolationist histories of various little bits, which is only bridgeable by what I call a politics of victimhood and a politics of comparative victimhood. I go back to an iconic essay by one of the protagonists of the brand name that has become South Asian history for the Americans, which claims that post-colonial histories operate by recognizing the comparative victimhood of other comparatively victimized places. And now, so this has become something of an Olympic race to the bottom, where the more victimized you can claim yourself to be, the more legitimation you have in history. And this is actually not so much a matter of historical account, because you cannot actually compare the tragedy of one people with the tragedy of another people. And equally tragically, one victim people is not necessarily happy to acknowledge the victimhood of another victim people and simply not victimize another victim people because they themselves were once victims. What you have left then is something which is epitomized for me in an interview of the filmmaker Spike Lee for Rolling Stone, where his interviewer, who was of Jewish origin, had a long argument about whether Jews or black people had suffered more in history, and neither of them were particularly victimized, so it was a kind of bizarre exercise to start with. But then we have these isolationist histories where everybody claims, for instance, that Indian history alag hai, it's different, which to me is an advertisement that I remember from the Doordarshan days, which was actually an attempt to get a Swiss multinational company to put its sauce on our tables. But it was phrased in terms of, this is different. And now, after 30 years of saying it's all different, we don't any longer know what it is different from. So you reproduce an essence of indigenism, where we are different but we don't know why, but we insist we are. And then everybody has this very specific history. If you also look at the history of the concept of the indigenous and forget that interdisciplinarity requires us to understand that it was invented at some point by anthropologists, and then indigenous became equated with the authentic and the pure, and then tradition became something which was not just invented but valorized. Then the Enlightenment was confused with romanticism, by which I mean the Enlightenment which claims a universalism, gives way to a romanticism which asserts the natural genius of a particular people. So of course we could claim that we in India now have a romantic civilization. This goes together with histories of alternative or non-Western thinking. So in some versions, whereas once science was the domain of the European and therefore the rational, because of course we never had anything rational away from Europe, now we celebrate non-Western sciences as a way of celebrating the irrational. Academics therefore prepare the way for Ganesha's retrospective plastic surgery or anticipate the Vedic atom bomb. So we have a manufactured consensus, if you like, that we're all very different. And this brings me to an attempt to break out of the frustration of my own profession into something which is more relevant, I think. I think that we all would be happy to accept that we're not, any of us, speaking from a disinterested position of absolute objectivity. The argument that we are all interested parties hasn't been interesting, at least since the 1960s, because it's been fully acknowledged everywhere. What's interesting, therefore, is that despite the fact that there are infinite possible interpretations, there are only a few plausible ones which will be accepted outside of your own imagination. And these plausible interpretations are the core of what is discussed. Now, to my mind, a discussion requires a point of agreement on what you disagree about. Because if you do not agree what you're talking about, you're not actually conversing. And so, if a discipline has lost that ability to talk within itself, it can only kind of exist in a Facebook universe of moral outrage and sensitivity. And increasingly, I wonder whether most professional academics are not spending far too much time honing their skills in writing Twitter feeds rather than writing actual academic accounts. Now, this defense of the academic is not a defense of irrelevance, but I believe we're doing two separate things. I think we're doing our professional work, which is supposed to meet certain academic standards, and we need to actually arrest this slide of academic standards. I appeal to those of the community of journalists who have actually written fine histories to hold us to that standard that once the law would do, and to say that from the point of view of academic rigor, this is bullshit. I can refer to books which argue with dead white people as if they're sitting next to us now. And my question is, why are we fighting battles that are no longer relevant? You're not actually going to argue with the gunda at the street corner sitting in the tea shop in terms of history. You're going to have to use his language. Now, in order to do that, you cannot write your history in his language. However, there is a separate and equally important thing if you think of yourself as a politically engaged person, and this is separate from and distinct to your professional engagement. You are therefore speaking as a politically engaged figure with a certain knowledge of history behind you to back it up. It could be another discipline. And that is a completely separate and perhaps for you equally important exercise. It may not be the same exercise for someone else. I don't want to keep this in this abstract measure to such an extent. I want to put it in a little recent perspective. Now, first from the discipline's point of view, we complain now that in questions of recruitment and in questions of blackmailing and intimidating colleagues, there is a certain attempt by what we might as short form call the Hindutva gang. And it tries to impose a certain consensus on us that it is these Hindutva histories of the authentic and the indigenous that should be told. From the recruitment point of view, the so-called left or the so-called center was at least similarly corrupt in its appointments. Professionals here will know that. And therefore, the only complaint we can have is that at least we, assuming that we are the left or the liberals or the Tukre gang or whatever they want, have the better historians, which reminds me of an old Tom Lehrer song, Remember the War Against Franco. That's the kind where all of us belong. So what if we lost all the battles? We had all the good songs. Yeah. That's the professional side. There's the question of how we polemicize our histories, and I think that one of the problems of people who identify as left-wing historians that have always had is an equally selective understanding of what they wish to present. Now this actually links in an uncomfortable way with identitarianism, because once upon a time the person who wrote might not be a nice person, might not be somebody you agreed with, might actually be somebody you find reprehensible. But if they made an argument that had to be dealt with, you had to deal with the argument. You couldn't simply attack the person. Now this is no longer the situation, because at least since post-colonialism's hegemony, you would ask who people's parents were, what their caste was, what their religion was, before you asked what did they write. Now I think if you do this, you have to go a step further. You have to then actually look at the logic of the position that they defend, their political and social connections, their organizations, their professional milieu, and you might actually get a very different response. In shorthand, you would get what in American politics is called the phenomenon of Uncle Tomming. Essentially, it means somebody who may be from an underprivileged background but who collaborates with privilege. Right? But the other disturbing thing, and I think I would restrict my example to 1942. It's always said that in 1942, the great Quit India movement, the Sangh Parivar's predecessors in the RSS or the Hindu Mahasabha played no role. And this is completely true. But this is a polemic, because what you're doing is you're legitimating the future of an entire political tradition in terms of what they did or did not do in a completely different context. The Communist Party of India did not support the Quit India movement because they felt that it was important in an international context for fascism to be defeated. And by fascists, they also included the predecessors of the current Sangh Parivar as people they believed should be defeated. And because they did not wish to disrupt this war effort, they decided to use the fact that they were now suddenly legal, because the Soviet Union was at war, to mobilize, but not to support a movement that would lead to the defeat of British India or of Britain. Now, obviously, the British knew this game, and therefore they were aware that they should not release all the communists. There were non-party line communists who were never released, and there were, in fact, party line communists who broke the party line and participated in the Quit India movement. So, because this is a very contradictory time, where two very strong and equally important political interpretations of the future were at stake in the movement, the idea that one group should be polemicized against as opposed to another, by instrumentalizing that history entirely in anti-Hindutva mode, is something that I find as disturbing as some of the much more obviously ridiculous things that are coming up through the Hindutva brigade. And I think that neither the profession nor the politics that we wish to promote is done any service by a kind of selective manipulation of histories for the polemic. Because it essentially means you leave spaces open for a counter polemic. And I have one set of examples which would illustrate this more carefully, where you realize that a kind of anti-Westernism that took the form of a kind of pro-indigenism in cultural terms that beset the Indian public domain from the 90s was something that was shared by left and right, at least by the official left parties and by the official right parties. And this was this idea of Westernization being a kind of culturally corroding phenomenon. Right? Now, I have never understood where this mythical West is, and I think that following Edward Said, we might want to coin the term Occidentalism, and suggest that this West doesn't exist except as a necessary counterpoint to us, and that we can only be us if we have this evil demon in the background. And so the differentiation of what we consider the West never happens. And one of the major contributions of imperialism to colonial thinking is that the collective is always more important than the individual. One of the important things about Enlightenment thinking is that the individual has a right to a self-fulfilled development as an individual. Now, the contradiction there is already present in nationalism, because the national offers you the right to self-determination, but that self is a collective self. So we're stuck. As long as we're anti-Western, we can only hide in our various communities, identities, and little boxes. As these little boxes are self-reinforcing, because you are not me, you cannot speak for me or even with me, the idea that solidarities have to be built, solidarity in one view now is epistemic violence, the idea that solidarity must reach out and organize, and that nobody wishes to permanently be an oppressed minority, even though some members of a community have a right and an interest in being an oppressed minority, and will therefore be empowered by the oppression of usually his fellow subjects. This idea is losing ground. And as we have always said politically, you defend a status quo by being unable to oppose it in any effective way. This doesn't take us out of the existential crisis. I don't know if we can really answer the question, what have historians ever done for us? But I think I can say that historians are doing less and less for us, given the current state of affairs. I have also suggested that we can overcome this situation only by thinking very carefully about what agenda we pick up and who's going to set it. And in effect, we are at the beginning of a tunnel of really asking, what is it that we do? Now, usually, it is said nowadays that technical and scientific skills are actually built by technical and scientific education. What do the humanities actually do? And we don't have an answer to this anymore as humanities people. Are we teaching any skills? Hell no. So why do we exist? And if somebody says to me, we're not going to fund this shit, I'll say, well, given what we are doing at the moment, I have to agree with you. I wouldn't fund this shit. Unfortunately, I'm not in a position to fund anything. I'll stop here. Thank you.